The town of Marin's Hollow, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place that didn't appear on GPS unless you already knew to look for it. Tucked between two ridges of the Allegheny foothills, it held perhaps 400 souls in its winter count, fewer in its pride. There was one gas station that doubled as a bait shop, a diner called Patty's that served pie in every season, a post office open 3 days a week, a church with a cracked bell that rang on Sundays anyway, defiant in its imperfection. And there was, on the corner of Birch and Callaway, a narrow shop with a hand-painted sign that read, Elena's Alterations and Made to Order. It was late October when the black car appeared. Not a flashy car, nothing that screamed money in a vulgar way. A dark charcoal Mercedes, its paint dulled deliberately, its plates from Ohio. It rolled into the gravel lot beside the Hollow's only bed and breakfast, and the man who stepped out of it stood still for a long moment in the cold air, as if testing whether the silence would hold him. He was tall, that was the first thing. Broad across the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with years. Years of carrying things no body should carry. His hair was dark and silver at the temples, cut close. His jaw was a sculptor's afterthought, all clean angles and old tension. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than most people in Marin's Hollow made in a month, but he wore it like a man who'd forgotten what things cost a long time ago. His name, according to the reservation he'd made by phone, was Marco Voss. That was not entirely true. His name was Marco Vitale, and 3 weeks ago he had been the head of the Vitale organization, the most powerful Italian-American crime family operating between New York and Chicago. He had controlled ports, unions, judges, and, for a brief and particularly ugly period in his 30s, a senator from New Jersey. He had ordered things done that he could not take back. He had watched men he loved die because of decisions he had made at a mahogany table in a penthouse 42 floors above the city. He was 46 years old, and he was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The transfer of power had taken 8 months to arrange. His underboss, a careful man named Santoro, who had waited patiently for exactly this invitation, had accepted the mantle with the kind of dignity that Marco had specifically selected him for. The families had been consulted, the territories had been redrawn with minimal blood, only 2 deaths, both of men who had made their own choices and known the cost. The lawyers had moved money through 12 different channels into accounts that Marco could access under a name that wasn't quite his own. He had not fled. That distinction mattered to him, perhaps more than it should have. He had left. There was a difference, though he was beginning to understand that the rest of the world might not recognize it. The bed and breakfast was run by a woman named Doris Schraft, who was 71 years old, suspicious of strangers on principle, and the best judge of character in 4 counties. She had watched Marco Voss carry his single bag, one bag, for a man who'd reserved the room indefinitely, up the porch steps, and she had studied him the way she studied things that didn't add up. "You running from something?" she asked, not unkindly, as she handed him the key. Marco looked at her for a moment. He had a way of going very still when something surprised him, a remnant of years spent in rooms where any reaction could be read as weakness. "I'm running towards something," he said. "I just don't know what it is yet." Doris Schraft considered this. "That's honest enough," she said, and showed him to his room. It was small. White walls, a quilt in blue and yellow, a window that looked out on bare maple trees and the ridgeline beyond them. There was a writing desk in the corner and a lamp that needed a new bulb. The radiator made a sound like an old man settling into a chair. Marco sat on the edge of the bed and put his hands on his knees and looked at the window for a very long time. He had owned a penthouse in Manhattan. He had owned a villa outside Naples. He had owned a ranch in Montana that he'd visited precisely twice. He had owned things the way men of his world owned things, as demonstrations, as fortifications, as proof of what you were capable of taking. This room, with its yellow quilt and its insufficient lamp, was the first space in 20 years that felt like it might belong to him in a way that mattered. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did. But when the first pale light came through the maple trees, he got up and put on his coat and walked out into the hollow, and he let the cold air fill him up. And for the first time in a very long time, nobody needed anything from him. It was, he thought, a beginning. He noticed the shop on his second morning walk. The sign was hand-lettered in a deep burgundy paint, precise and unhurried. The window display showed a half-finished emerald dress on a dressmaker's form, pinned with a dozen silver pins that caught the early light. Beside it, a bolt of cream fabric was draped with such casual artistry that it looked like it had simply chosen to rest there. There was a light on inside, though the sign said the shop didn't open until 9. Someone was already working. Marco stood on the opposite sidewalk and looked at the light in the window for longer than he meant to. He couldn't have explained why. He had seen beautiful things his entire life. Beautiful art, beautiful women, beautiful violence. He had learned to receive beauty the way one received a threat, with assessment, with strategy, with the part of the brain that calculated what it meant. But the light in that window, warm and steady at 7 in the morning in a cold October town, did something to the part of him that was older than strategy. It made him feel the absence of something he hadn't noticed he'd lost. He walked on. He came back the next morning, and the next. On the 4th morning, the door to the shop opened just as he was passing, and the woman who stepped out to hang a small chalkboard sign on the door hook nearly walked into him. She caught herself. He caught her. One hand at her elbow, automatic, careful. "Sorry," she said, looking up. And then she looked at him the way Doris Schraft had looked at him, that frank, unglamorous appraisal that small towns produced in their people like a natural resource. "You're the man staying at Doris's." "I am." "Marco Voss," she said. It wasn't a question. Small towns. "Elena," he said, reading her name from the sign without thinking. She had dark eyes, deep brown, almost black in the morning light, and dark hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with carelessness and everything to do with a woman who had work to do and didn't need her hair in the way. She was perhaps 40, perhaps a year or two on either side. Her face had the particular beauty of a woman who had never relied on it, so it had settled into something more lasting. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes, a mouth that looked like it told the truth, cheekbones that would still be there when everything else had softened. She was wearing a deep blue cardigan with a measuring tape looped around her neck like a necklace she'd forgotten to take off, and there was a small constellation of pin marks on her left sleeve where she'd pressed needles in the absent habit of her craft. She looked at him with no particular fear and no particular welcome, just the clear-eyed neutrality of a woman who had learned to take people as they came. "Well," she said, "you're up early." "I don't sleep much," he said. "Neither do I." She looked at him for one more beat, then at the chalkboard sign she'd been meaning to hang, then back at him. "The diner opens at 7 if you need coffee." "Thank you," he said. She nodded, hung the sign, "Open, walk-ins welcome," and went back inside. Marco stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold air. Something in his chest had shifted, barely perceptibly, like a lock mechanism that had felt a key for the first time and didn't yet know what to do with the sensation. He walked to the diner. He drank his coffee. He watched the maple trees lose their last leaves to the October wind, and he thought about a woman with a measuring tape around her neck and pin marks on her sleeve, who had looked at him without fear. In his former life, people who weren't afraid of him were either very powerful or very foolish. He had a feeling Elena Vasquez was neither. Elena Vasquez had lived in Marin's Hollow for 11 years, which meant she had arrived as a stranger and was now, by the town's patient arithmetic, something close to a local. She had come from Philadelphia, from a marriage that had lasted 7 years and ended with the quiet, devastating courtesy that sometimes accompanies the death of love between two people who had genuinely tried. Her ex-husband, Daniel, was a good man. That was the saddest part. He was kind and reliable and entirely unable to see her, the real shape of her, the one that stayed up until 2 in the morning with fabric and thread because the work was the only place where what she imagined and what she created were exactly the same thing. She had packed her sewing machines, her bolts of fabric, her considerable library of pattern books, and precisely nothing else. And she had driven until the highway gave way to state roads, and the state roads gave way to county routes, and the county routes gave way to a 2-lane road that wound between hills. And she had seen the hollow below her in the October dusk and thought, there. She had no idea why. She still didn't, 11 years on. But the town had taken her in, the way old places sometimes took in the quietly wounded, with minimum fuss and maximum practical assistance. Doris Schraft had rented her the shop space for the first year at a rate that was frankly charitable. The women of the Hollow had brought her casseroles, and, more valuably, their hems and their alterations and their daughters' prom dresses, and word had spread to the surrounding towns that the woman on Birch and Calloway could make a wedding dress from scratch that would make the bride cry before she even put it on. Elena was good at her work. She was exceptional at it, actually, though she said this to no one, because she'd grown up in a house where competence was expected and praised in proportion, which was to say, not very much. She understood fabric the way some people understood music, not just as notes, but as the whole invisible architecture of feeling that lived inside sound. She knew how a seam could lift a woman's confidence. She knew how the weight of a hem changed the way a person moved through a room. She lived above the shop, in 3 rooms that were comfortably cluttered with the detritus of a life organized around making things. Her kitchen table was usually half covered with pattern pieces. Her bookshelves held fabric swatches, catalogued by color alongside novels she read slowly, 1 chapter at a time, in the last hour before sleep. She had a cat named Volta, who was large and orange and expressed love through aggression, and a collection of plants on the east-facing windowsill that she talked to when she was working through a difficult design. She was happy. That was the word she used when people asked, and she meant it more than she'd meant many things. It was not the large, demonstrative happiness of someone who had everything they wanted. It was the smaller, more durable happiness of someone who had learned what they needed and built a life around those things. She was also, and this was a fact she acknowledged to herself with the same clear-eyed practicality she applied to everything, occasionally lonely, in the way that a person who had closed their heart gently but firmly could be lonely. Not for company, she had company, the whole town was company. Lonely in the particular way that only another specific person could remedy, and she had not met that person, and she had made her peace with that, mostly. Marco Voss, she decided on the morning of their brief sidewalk introduction, was a man with a complicated past. This was not a deduction that required great insight. It was simply visible, the way certain things were visible in fabric, stress points, old repairs, the places where something had been pulled too tight and left a permanent distortion in the weave. He was beautiful in the way that worn things were beautiful. The kind of face that had been handsome once in a conventional way and was now more interesting than that, carved by time and whatever it was that had carved him into something you wanted to keep looking at even when you knew you should probably look away. She did not ask Doris about him. She didn't need to. Doris would tell her in her own time if there was anything to tell. And she did not ask him anything more than the bare minimum of courtesy required by the accident of nearly walking into each other on the sidewalk. She had learned, over the course of 42 years, that people told you what they wanted you to know, when they were ready, and that pressing for more was an act of aggression dressed up as interest. But she noticed things, because she always noticed things. That was her particular curse and gift. She noticed that he walked every morning before 7, always in the same direction, always alone. She noticed that he stood sometimes on the sidewalk across from the shop and looked at her window with an expression she couldn't fully decode from 30 feet away. She noticed that when he finally came into Patty's Diner on a Wednesday morning, she was there picking up a coffee to go, as she did most Wednesdays. He sat with his back to the wall and watched the room with a steadiness that wasn't paranoia so much as habit. The habit of a man who had needed to know where the exits were for a long time. She noticed his hands. This was inevitable. She was a woman who spent her life with her hands, and therefore noticed other people's. His were large and marked with small old scars. Not the kind from a kitchen or a workshop, but the kind from something she didn't name to herself. They held his coffee cup with a gentleness that seemed deliberate, like a man who was practicing something. What surprised her, and she turned this over in her mind during a long Thursday of hemming bridesmaid dresses for the Kowalski girls' wedding, was that none of this frightened her. She was a woman of reasonable caution. She locked her doors. She trusted her instincts. And her instincts, which had never failed her in any significant way, said only, "Here is a man in the middle of a long journey, and he has stopped here to rest." That was all. On Friday, the shop bell rang at 10:30, and she looked up from the steamer to find Marco Voss standing inside her door. He was wearing dark trousers and a dark sweater, and he held his coat over one arm, and he looked around the shop with the same careful attention he seemed to apply to everything. His eyes moved over the bolts of fabric, the dressmaker's forms in their various states of dress, the long work table covered with pattern pieces and marking chalk, the ancient industrial machine in the corner, and the newer computerized one beside it. He took it all in without expression. Then he looked at her. "I have a coat," he said. "The lining is torn. Someone told me you do repairs." "Who told you?" "The woman at the diner, Patty." Elena set down the steamer. "Let me see it." He handed over the coat, the charcoal overcoat she'd noticed on him the first day, and even from a distance she had known it was beautifully made, real cashmere, Italian cut, the kind of garment that cost enough to be considered an investment. She turned it inside out and found the tear, a clean split in the black silk lining, about 4 inches, running along the inside left seam. $12, she said. "It'll take about 20 minutes if you want to wait." He looked at the chair near the window, a comfortable old armchair she kept for clients who were waiting. "May I?" "Of course." He sat. She threaded her needle, and the two of them spent 20 minutes in the particular quiet of a workroom where someone is making something, which is a quieter quiet than most. He didn't try to make conversation. She noticed this. Most men, in her experience, filled silences reflexively, nervously, as if silence were a problem requiring a solution. Marco Voss sat in the armchair with his long legs stretched out slightly before him and watched her hands with an attentiveness that was not uncomfortable. It was just very present. "You've been watching my shop," she said when she was halfway through the repair. A pause. "Yes. Any particular reason?" "The light," he said. "In the mornings. You have a light on before anyone else in town." She glanced up. He was looking at his hands now, not at her. "I start early." "I know." He said it simply. "I don't sleep much." "You mentioned." Another pause. The needle moved through the silk. Outside, the Friday morning had turned gray, and a few first flurries of October snow were beginning to fall. Not seriously, just the sky reminding itself what was coming. "This is a good town," Marco said. It wasn't quite a statement and wasn't quite a question. "It's a quiet town," Elena said. "People mostly leave you alone if you want to be left alone, and mostly show up when you don't want to be alone. It takes them a while to sort out which one you need." "Which are you?" She looked up at him again. He was watching her now. His eyes were very dark, very still, the color of dark water. "Both," she said, "depending on the day." She finished the repair and snipped the thread and turned the coat right side out and handed it back to him. He ran a thumb along the inside seam, checking the work, and something crossed his face. A brief, unguarded appreciation, genuine and unperformed. "Perfect," he said. "It's a repair," she said. "I do better than perfect when I'm making something from scratch." He smiled then, barely, just a slight easing at the corners of his mouth, a softening around the eyes that transformed his face so momentarily and completely that she felt it almost as a physical thing, a change in the quality of air in the room. He laid a 20 on her work table. She made change from the tin on the shelf. He took his coat and his change and paused at the door. "Thank you," he said. "Come back if anything else needs fixing," she said, looking back at her work. The bell rang, the door closed. She kept her eyes on her work table for a full 30 seconds before she allowed herself to look up at the empty chair by the window. The snow outside was falling a little more seriously now. Volta, who had emerged from somewhere to wind around the leg of the dressmaker's form, looked out the window with his usual expression of contemptuous neutrality. Elena picked up her needle and went back to work. She was very good, she reminded herself, at not wanting things she couldn't have. She was also beginning to suspect that she was not quite as good as she'd believed. There were rules Marco had lived by for 26 years, and most of them were about distance. Distance from sentimentality, distance from attachment, distance from the kind of want that made you vulnerable, that gave other men a lever to use against you. In his world, love was a liability. Not because it wasn't real, He had watched men love their families with terrifying ferocity, but because the people who loved you were the people who could be used to unmake you. You kept what mattered to you close and hidden, like a wound you covered so no one could see where to press. He had not been without women. That would be dishonest. There had been a woman in his early 30s, a lawyer named Carla, who was clever enough to understand what he was and pragmatic enough to decide it was worth the cost. It had lasted 4 years, until she'd grown tired of the weight of things she couldn't ask about, and he had let her go with genuine sadness and a substantial amount of money that she'd refused on principle and accepted on practicality. He respected her for the refusal first. After Carla, there had been others, none lasting, none reaching the place in him that would have made them lasting. He had become expert at a particular kind of intimacy that was warm and complete and entirely contained, a clean transaction of affection that left no residue. It was, he understood now, in the cold-aired mornings of Marin's Hollow, a survival strategy. He had survived. That was not nothing. He was alive when a significant number of the men he had come up with were not. He had his health, mostly. A scar below his left shoulder blade from a knife in 1998, a knee that complained in wet weather from a car accident in 2004, and the particular internal scar tissue of a man who had eaten too many meals of tension and too few of anything good. But he was walking. He was breathing. He had all the fingers he'd been born with, which in his line of work was an accomplishment. He had stopped drinking 4 years ago, not dramatically, not at the bottom of anything. He simply noticed one morning that he was using it as upholstery for his interior life, padding all the hard corners, and he decided he didn't want his corners padded anymore. He wanted to feel the shape of things clearly, even if the shape was painful. That clarity was part of what had brought him here. He had been in rooms of tremendous power. He had sat across tables from men who could move markets and elections. He had been respected and feared in a way that most people confused with each other, but are not the same. Fear was a kind of negative space, an absence of safety. Respect was something built, brick by brick, out of demonstrated character. He had, in his time, earned some of both. And he had looked around those rooms, at 50, at 48, at 46, and understood with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has earned the right to his clarity. None of this is what I was for. The realization had not come like lightning. It had come like weather, gradual, inevitable, the temperature dropping by degrees until one morning you looked outside and saw that winter had arrived without asking permission. What was he for then? He didn't know yet. He was trying to find out. In his second week in Marin's Hollow, he bought a coffee plant at the small hardware store that also sold, improbably, houseplants. He did not know why. He had never owned a plant. He had never been in one place long enough to be responsible for something that needed consistent care. But the plant was small, and it had dark leaves, and the woman at the hardware store, a teenager who clearly considered this the most boring job in the universe, had told him it needed indirect light and watering once a week and would reward him, given time, with something useful. Something useful. He'd liked that. He put the plant on the windowsill of his room at Doris's and spent perhaps longer than was reasonable reading about its requirements on his phone. Then he watered it, carefully, and set it in the available light, and felt, absurdly, that he had accomplished something. Doris Schraft, who missed nothing, found him reading about coffee plants at the kitchen table the next morning while she made breakfast, and said nothing, but made a small sound of approval that she thought he didn't notice. He noticed. On a Tuesday in his third week, he had coffee at Patty's Diner long enough to become a regular, which, in Marin's Hollow, meant you had been there 3 times and ordered the same thing twice. Patty herself, a woman of 60 with the energy of a woman of 30 and the vocabulary of a truck driver, called him the quiet one, and gave him a corner table without being asked, and refilled his cup when it was empty. He began to know the town by its patterns. The retired mailman, Franklin, who walked his 2 golden retrievers along the creek path every morning at 8:15. The Kowalski family, who ran the feed store and had somewhere between 4 and 7 children, depending on which ones were home from college. The priest at the Cracked Bell Church, Father Michael, who jogged in the mornings in a way that suggested he had once been very fast and had made peace with being merely consistent. He watched all of it with the attention of a man who had spent 26 years watching rooms for threats and was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to watch them for something else. And he thought about the seamstress. He could not think about her. She was precise and present and entirely unimpressed by him. And those things together formed something he had no adequate word for, only the sensation, a warmth at the center of his chest that he kept examining from different angles, like a stone he'd picked up from the road and couldn't decide whether to keep or put down. He went back to the shop on a Wednesday, legitimately. A button had come off his good wool trousers, and he could not sew on a button himself because he had never learned, and was aware that this was absurd for a man of his age and education, but was nonetheless true. He stood outside the door for a moment before entering, which he recognized as ridiculous, and entered anyway. Elena was at the long work table, cutting fabric with a large pair of shears that moved through it with a sound like paper tearing, clean and definitive. She did not look up immediately. He stood at the door until she reached the end of her cut, and then she looked up. "Button," he said, holding up the trousers. "Leave them," she said. "I'll have them by tomorrow." "I can wait." She looked at him. "It's a button." "I know." A beat. Then she pointed at the chair. He sat. She went back to her cutting. "What's the fabric for?" he asked, after a while. She glanced up. "Wedding dress. The Morrison girl. She's getting married in March." "She picked her own fabric?" "She picked from what I showed her. I advised." She smoothed the cut edge with her fingertips, checking it. She wanted something that would look good in photographs. I talked her into something that would make her feel something when she was wearing it. "Is there a difference?" "Almost always." She gathered the cut pieces and set them aside. Things that photograph well tend to be about surfaces. Things that feel right tend to be about structure. He considered this. That's true of a lot of things. She looked at him for a moment, one of those clear, unhurried looks she had that felt like being assessed without being judged. "Yes," she said, "it is." She found a button from her tin, not a match to the original ones, which had been generic, but something better. A dark horn button with a subtle texture that was an improvement. She threaded her needle and sat across from him at the table, not beside him but at the far end, with the trousers across her lap. "Where are you from?" she asked. Not intrusively. It was the question the town was probably waiting for her to ask on its behalf. "New York," he said. Partly true. He had lived in New York for 15 years. "And before that?" "New Jersey." True. "Before that, Naples." Her hands kept moving. "You came a long way to stop." "Yes." "Are you stopping or just pausing?" He looked at her. She was watching her needle, not him. "I intend to stop," he said. "People who intend to stop sometimes don't," she said, without inflection. Not accusing, just noting. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to be different." She bit the thread, examined the button, handed back the trousers. "Good luck with that," she said, and she said it without irony, which was the most sincere form of the wish. He paid her. He left. He walked back to Doris's with his mended trousers under his arm, and he realized that his chest was doing the warm thing again, the stone he couldn't put down thing, and that he was going to have to get used to it because he did not think it was going away. That night he called Santoro, his first contact since leaving, as they'd agreed, and received a short report, smooth, no disruptions, an attempted incursion from the Marchetti people that had been handled quietly. Everything as it should be. "And you?" Santoro asked, with the careful effect of a man who was not entirely sure whether to ask. "I'm fine," Marco said. "You need anything?" "No." A pause. "You really left," Santoro said, not accusing, something like wonder. "I really left," Marco said. He stood at his window after he hung up and looked at the streetlight outside and the bare maples moving in the night wind, and below, on the corner of Birch and Calloway, the dark front of Elena's shop with its sign facing the empty street. He was really leaving. He was really trying. Whether he deserved to was a different question, and one he couldn't answer yet. November came to Marin's Hollow with cold authority and without apology. The ridgelines went gray, and the creek ran faster with the first serious rains, and the town settled into its winter rhythm, a drawing in, a making do, the comfortable austerity of people who had done this before and trusted they would do it again. Marco stayed. This surprised some people, though no one said so directly. Strangers passed through the hollow sometimes. Hikers in better seasons, the occasional artist or writer who'd heard about the quiet. But they left with the leaves. A man who stayed through the first hard frost was either running from something substantial or had found something worth keeping. The town, in its patient way, began to include him. It started with Franklin and the dogs. Marco walked the creek path every morning, and Franklin walked it at 8:15. And on the fourth morning, they had nodded at each other. And on the seventh morning, Franklin had said, "Cold one," and Marco had agreed. And by the end of the month, they had developed the particular friendship of men who meet outdoors in all weather and find each other reliable. Not intimate, not requiring much, but solid. It continued with Patty, who one morning set a piece of blueberry pie at his elbow, along with his coffee, and said, "On the house," in a tone that permitted no argument, and who gradually began telling him about the town. Not gossip, exactly, more like context. Who had been here for generations? Who had arrived like him from somewhere harder? What the town had been through, and what it had survived. He listened to all of it. He had always been a good listener. It was one of the skills of his former life, the ability to take in information without reacting, to hold what he heard without it showing on his face. But he was finding that listening in this new context was a different thing. Not listening for leverage or intelligence, just listening because people were interesting when they weren't afraid of you. He started helping at the hardware store on Thursdays. This was Bob Schraff's domain, Doris's nephew, a widower of 58 who ran the store alone and was slowly losing the battle against its organizational chaos. Marco had noticed this on his third visit and had offered, with no particular agenda, to help with the inventory. Bob had looked at him with the frank suspicion of a man who had been offered too many things with strings attached, and Marco had said, "I have time. You need help. That's all." Bob had accepted, and it had been that simple. Thursdays Marco spent in the hardware store, which was warm and smelled of oil and sawdust, cataloging and stacking and learning the names of things he had never needed to know the names of. Toggle bolts, weather stripping, PEX fittings, roofing nails in their specific gauges. He learned these things with the full attention of a man who understood that knowing the right name for something was the beginning of understanding it. He bought more plants. This had become, without his quite planning it, a habit. He had 3 now on the windowsill at Doris's: the coffee plant, a dark-leaved pothos that was beginning to trail pleasantly off the sill, and a small, stubborn jade plant that the hardware store teenager had told him was basically indestructible, a recommendation that appealed to him. He watered them on schedule and talked to them occasionally in the early morning, in Italian, which felt appropriate and also private in a way that he appreciated. Doris, passing his door one morning, heard him murmuring to the jade plant and did not comment, but made a slightly more pronounced sound of approval than usual. And Elena. Elena was a presence that organized itself around him gradually, the way a pattern emerges from cloth. You don't see it until you step back, and then suddenly it's all you can see. She was not pursuing anything, neither was he, but they kept encountering each other with the gentle inevitability of people who lived in a small town and operated on similar schedules. Tuesday mornings she bought coffee at Patty's. So did he. They began to get their coffee at the same time, which meant arriving at the same time, which meant sitting across from each other for 20 minutes at the corner table that Patty had decided belonged to the two of them without asking either of them. Elena did not talk about herself and did not ask about him. She talked about the work, what she was making, what was giving her trouble, what she'd solved. She had opinions about fabric the way some people had opinions about wine, specific, earned, articulately held. She could talk about the particular fall of a bias-cut silk for 5 minutes, in a way that made him understand not just the silk, but something about what she was after, what she wanted a piece of fabric to do in the world. He discovered that he looked forward to Tuesdays. This discovery arrived with the particular texture of things he didn't quite have permission for. He sat with it on a Tuesday evening after she'd gone back to her shop, and he'd walked to the creek and stood by the water for a while, letting the cold off it clear his head. He was a man who had ordered deaths. This was not a metaphor. He had, in the course of 26 years, given orders that ended human lives. Some of those men had deserved it by any measure he could apply to the word. Some had been in the wrong place with the wrong loyalties. One, he carried this one differently from the others, had been a mistake he had not permitted himself to stop knowing was a mistake. A man named Cesare, who had been suspected of talking to the feds, and had been, it turned out, completely innocent, and had died for it before the truth emerged. Marco had compensated Cesare's family. That was what he had been able to do. It was nothing like enough. He did not believe in God, exactly, but he believed in debt. He believed that what he had done had weight, and that the weight did not go away, and that he could not put it down but only carry it differently, more honestly, perhaps, with more intention. He did not deserve Elena. He knew this with a clarity that was not self-pity, but arithmetic. She was clean in a way that he was not, and clear, and built her life with patience and precision, and the last thing she needed was a man who had left 26 years of shadow behind him like a wake. He walked back from the creek in the dark and sat down on his bed and looked at his plants in the window. The coffee plant had new leaves. He hadn't noticed them growing, but here they were, 2 small new leaves, tender and dark, curled at first and now beginning to unfurl. They had been growing quietly, without announcement, in the time he'd been tending to everything else. He sat and looked at them for a long time. Then he got up and wrote, in the small notebook he'd started keeping, the first diary of his life, begun at age 46, a single sentence. I am not sure what I am allowed to want, but I am beginning to understand that I want it anyway. The first time Elena saw the scar was an accident. It was the first week of December, a Thursday, and she'd been delivering a repaired coat to Bob Schraft at the hardware store. He was a steady customer, hard on his work clothes, and found Marco there, on a step stool, reorganizing the top shelf of the fasteners aisle. He was in a gray Henley with the sleeves pushed up, and when he reached to place a box at the back of the shelf, the fabric pulled up above his waistband for a moment, and she saw, along the left side of his torso, a white ridge of old scar tissue, maybe 3 inches long, shaped like something that had been wrong and had healed into merely different. She didn't react. She had learned, in her years as a woman who encountered all kinds of bodies in the intimate context of fitting and alteration, to register physical information without performing a response to it. But she carried it home with her, turned it over in her mind the way she turned over a difficult design problem, not intrusively, but honestly. Marco Voss was a man who had been hurt in a specific way. The shape and placement of that scar said knife, or something very like it. It had healed a long time ago. She had known, from the first morning, that he was a man with a complicated past. The past was written in him visibly, in the way he sat, the way he watched rooms, the deliberate carefulness of his hands, the way he applied more attention to minor things than minor things usually warranted, as if he'd spent years in an environment where underestimating minor things was fatal. She did not ask him about it. That was the correct choice, and she knew it. Some stories were not hers to demand. But that evening, after she'd closed the shop and fed Volta and made herself tea, she sat in the window with her cup and looked at the snow that was beginning to come down in proper earnest now. The first real snow of the season, laying a clean, white silence over the whole hollow. She thought about what she knew about loneliness. She knew that it came in different forms, and that the most insidious form was not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being with people who could not reach you. She had been married for 7 years, and had been lonely in that way for at least 4 of them, and Daniel hadn't known, and she hadn't told him, because telling him would have required explaining something she didn't yet have words for. She thought Marco Voss had been lonely in that way for much longer than she had. She thought about the careful way he had of being present, fully present, not distracted, but with something held in reserve, something behind the stillness that he watched from, as if he were not quite sure he'd earned the right to be all the way in any given room. She understood that feeling. She had felt it once, in the years after her marriage ended, when she kept waiting for someone to tell her she'd done something wrong. The snow fell. Volta climbed into her lap with his usual lack of ceremony. She drank her tea. On Friday morning, she left a plate of roscetti, her grandmother's almond cookies, a recipe she made every year in December for no reason except that the smell of them made her feel located in time, on the step outside the door to Doris's bed and breakfast, with a note that said, "For the house. Happy December. E." This was a thing she did. She left food for the people who lived near her in winter, as a practice, as a way of saying, "I know you're there. The dark doesn't bother me." She left food for Doris, and for Franklin, and for the Kowalskis, and for Father Michael. She didn't specifically leave the cookies for Marco. But when she passed Doris's on her morning walk and saw him standing in the doorway with the plate and the note, holding a cookie and reading her handwriting with an expression she couldn't decipher, something carefully controlled that moved underneath his face like weather under ice, she was glad she had. He looked up and saw her. She lifted a hand, a small wave, nothing requiring anything. He lifted a hand back. She walked on. That afternoon, he came into the shop. Not for a repair this time. He stood at the door with his coat and his careful stillness and said, "Do you make things for men?" She turned from the dressmaker's form she'd been working on. "Occasionally. What do you need?" "I don't know," he said, which was honest in a way that surprised her. "I've always bought things. I've never had anything made for me." She studied him, the breadth of his shoulders, the particular way he held himself, straight but not stiff, contained but not closed. "You should," she said. "There's no good reason for a man built like you to wear things that were made for someone else." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a professional opinion?" "All my opinions are professional," she said, and she heard herself, the small warmth in it, and didn't try to take it back. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion. I'd like something that fits." He paused. "I haven't had anything that fit in a long time, in the literal sense." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the shelf and took out her cloth measuring tape, not the decorative one she wore around her neck, but the long one she used for real fittings. "Take off your coat," she said. He did. She moved around him with the professional briskness that fittings required, noting numbers and jotting them in her small notebook. His shoulders, 47 inches. His chest, his waist. She moved with the neutral efficiency she always used for this, the impersonal intimacy of the craft. She was reaching around him to measure from shoulder blade to shoulder blade when she felt, under her hands through the fabric of his sweater, the scar she'd seen in profile from across the hardware store aisle. It was larger than she'd estimated, or there were two of them. She felt him go almost imperceptibly still when her hands passed over that spot. She didn't comment. She wrote the number in her notebook. "What fabric?" she said, stepping back. "Whatever you think is right," he said. She looked at him. The dark hair, the dark eyes, the face that had been beautiful once and was now more than beautiful. "Charcoal wool," she said. "Heavy. You run cold, and you've been wearing that cashmere coat like it's doing enough work. It isn't." He looked at her. "You've noticed that." "I notice things," she said simply. "I know," he said. "You're very quiet about what you notice." "That's a skill," she said. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." She made tea. She made tea for clients who were waiting. It was her one hospitality, and handed him a cup, and they sat across from each other in the late afternoon light while the snow came down outside, and she made preliminary sketches for his jacket, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling. December deepened. The town went Christmas-lit and smelled of wood smoke and cold. The cracked bell rang every Sunday with a kind of stubborn conviction that Marco had come to find oddly moving. He was becoming a fixture. Not in the way he'd been a fixture in his former life, not feared, not deferred to, not noticed for what he could do to you. He was becoming a fixture in the way of someone who shows up consistently and asks for nothing in particular and gradually gets counted in the town's arithmetic. Doris made him dinner twice a week now, a fact she framed as practicality. "I make too much for one person, and it's wasteful." And he accepted it on the same terms and set the table and washed the dishes after, which she pretended not to appreciate and did. He was building something. He could feel it. Not his former life's kind of building, all vertical ambition and consolidating force, but something horizontal, spreading outward, slowly, putting roots into the cold ground. The jacket Elena made him was finished on the 15th of December. He had checked in twice during the making of it, once when she called to say she had a question about the collar, and once when she asked him to come in for an interim fitting when the shell was basted together. He had stood in the center of her workroom with his arms slightly out while she moved around him with pins, adjusting, making minute corrections with the absolute confidence of someone who knew precisely what they were after. And he had been struck, both times, by the extraordinary intimacy of being fitted, the way it required trust, the willingness to be measured and found specific. The jacket was charcoal wool, as she'd said, with a faint, subtle texture in the weave, and a collar that was higher than standard, that sat at the back of his neck in a way that felt like warmth rather than restriction. The cut across his shoulders was exact. Every seam fell where it was supposed to fall. He put it on and stood in front of her small mirror and saw himself clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. Not the man he had been, the commanding, untouchable, carefully constructed version. Just himself. The man he was at 46, with his silver-templed hair and his careful eyes and all the things he'd done and carried. Himself, fitted precisely for what he was. "It's remarkable," he said. "It's a jacket," she said, but she was pleased. He could see it in the small, controlled press of her lips, the way her eyes moved over the garment with satisfaction. "Not every jacket is this," he said. "What you made here is not the same thing as what you buy. There's something—" He paused, looking for the word. "There's intention in it." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "That's the right word," she said, quietly. "That's exactly the right word." He paid her. The amount felt inadequate for what she'd made, and he said so. She told him the price was the price, and he was welcome to give the difference to the food pantry 2 towns over, which he did, immediately, on his phone, while she watched with what might have been approval. "You didn't have to do that right now," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." On Christmas Eve, the Hollow had a tradition. The whole town gathered in the small square outside the Cracked Bell Church for an hour of carols and hot cider, and then everyone went home, or to whoever's home they'd been claimed by. It was not religious specifically, or not only. It was the town recognizing itself, marking that it had made it through another year. Marco came. He stood at the edge of the gathered people with his new charcoal jacket and his cup of cider, and watched the light from the strung bulbs move on the snow, and thought that he had not been part of a gathering of this kind. Voluntary, unbought, unstrategic, in perhaps his entire adult life. Elena was there with her neighbor, a woman named Becca, who laughed loudly and often and had clearly decided Elena was her project. Elena stood slightly apart from the main cluster, the way she did, close enough to be part of things and space enough to be herself. She was wearing a deep wine-red coat that he had not seen before, and her dark hair was down, also something he had not seen, and it changed the architecture of her entirely. The same woman, suddenly fuller somehow, more present in the air around her. She caught his eye across the square and lifted her cider cup slightly in a small toast. He lifted his. They did not speak. They were 30 feet apart and surrounded by people singing "O Holy Night" with more enthusiasm than precision. But that small, quiet gesture across the cold dark felt like something. Like 2 people who had been circling each other, finally admitting, at least between themselves, that they were circling. He walked home after, alone in the falling snow, and he thought about what it meant to deserve a thing, about the shape of the life he was trying to build, about a woman with dark eyes who made things fit. On Christmas morning, someone had left a small package on the sill outside his window at Doris's. A single branch of dark rosemary, tied with red thread, and a card that said, "Merry Christmas, neighbor." He put the rosemary in a glass of water on the windowsill beside his plants. It was not a plant, but it was a growing thing, green and sharp-scented, and it seemed to belong there. He did not examine what he felt about this too directly. He was, he had decided, done being afraid of his own wanting. He was allowed to want. He was not sure he was allowed to act, but he could want, and he could tend to what was growing carefully, with all the patience he had finally, at 46, actually developed. His phone rang on Christmas afternoon. A number he didn't recognize, which meant it was someone from his old life using a burner. He sat with the phone in his hand and let it ring out and then blocked the number. He was done with being found. January in the Allegheny foothills was not January anywhere else. It was specific and demanding and had no interest in your feelings about it. The cold came down from the ridges in the night and settled into the hollow like something that intended to stay, and the town contracted further around its warmth. Each house an island of light in the white dark, connected to the others by the thin thread of footprints in snow. Marco ran in January, in the mornings before the town woke up. He had run all his adult life, not for the pleasure of it, but for the necessity. A man who spent most of his days in cars and offices and the controlled climates of power needed the brutality of physical effort to remain sane. He ran now through the empty streets of the hollow in the dark, his breath clouding, his feet finding the packed snow of the creek path, and he thought of nothing in particular and everything at once. He was making peace with his past. This was not a clean process. It was not the narrative arc he might have constructed for himself if he'd been the author, the dramatic break, the single clear moment of redemption. It was smaller than that, more daily, more uncomfortable. It was waking up at 3 in the morning with his heart going too fast and lying still in the dark until it slowed. It was the occasional morning when he sat down to breakfast and the smell of something, coffee sometimes, or a particular kind of smoke from the hardware store's old furnace, sent him back somewhere he'd rather not go, and he had to breathe through it and come back. He had started, in January, writing letters he would not send. To Cesare's family, a letter that he revised 17 times and still could not get right because there were no right words, only honest ones, and honest was not the same as sufficient. To the men who had served under him, not all of them, but the ones he'd watched carry weight they didn't sign up for, the young ones who'd come into his world because it was the world they were born into and hadn't known how to leave. He wrote these letters in the notebook, and he did not know what to do with them except write them. Maybe that was enough. Maybe the record of having tried to account for himself was the only accounting he'd ever actually get. He was at Patty's on a Tuesday in mid-January when Elena came in, and the weather, which had been threatening all morning, made good on its threat with a sudden dump of snow that within 20 minutes had made the short walk back to her shop inadvisable. She sat across from him at the corner table and looked at the window. "I have 3 bridesmaid dresses to finish by Saturday," she said. "Do you have what you need at the shop?" "Everything except time, if this keeps up." He thought for a moment. "I can drive you when it slows down." She looked at him. "I live 2 blocks away." 2 blocks in this could be unpleasant. "I'm from Philadelphia," she said, dry. "I know about unpleasant winter." "Then call it a favor to me," he said. "I have nothing to do this afternoon." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the window. "All right," she said. They sat for 2 hours while the snow came down, and they talked. Really talked, the way they hadn't quite managed in the Tuesday morning quicknesses. Longer, less careful, the kind of conversation that happened when 2 people were effectively snowed in together, even in a public place, and decided to use the time. She told him about her grandmother, who had been a seamstress in Seville, and had brought her craft to America with nothing else, and had spent 50 years making it mean something, who had taught Elena to sew at age 7, not as a girl's activity, but as a serious transmission of knowledge. "This is what I know. Now you know it. Carry it forward." He told her about Naples, not the darker part, not yet, not ever, maybe, but the real Naples of his childhood, the narrow streets of Spaccanapoli, the noise and color and smell of it, his mother's kitchen, the way the whole city smelled of salt and old stone and something frying in olive oil at every hour of the day and night. "You miss it," she said. "I miss what it was before I understood what it was," he said. "I miss being a person who could live in it simply." She looked at him with those dark, careful eyes. "What happened?" "I made choices," he said. He said it simply, without drama, looking at his coffee cup. "I made choices when I was young that I thought I understood, and turned out I didn't. And by the time I understood, I had made too many of them to change course easily." "So you changed course hard," she said. Eventually, he looked up. 11 years ago you changed course. I changed course, she agreed. Mine was softer, maybe. A marriage that didn't fit instead of... She paused. Whatever yours was. He watched her. How did you know what fit looked like? After. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow. I didn't, she finally said. I still don't really. I just know this town fits, and the work fits, and being my own size fits. I stopped trying to be whatever shape the space required and just became the shape I was. He held that, the shape I was. I've spent most of my life, he said slowly, being the shape other people needed me to be. I know, she said, quietly, without judgment. He drove her back to the shop when the snow slowed, and she said goodbye at the door with that composed simplicity she had, and he watched her go inside, and he sat in the car for a moment before driving back to Doris's. He was not in love with her yet. He was honest with himself about this. What he was in was something that preceded love, something more tentative and more foundational. He was in the territory of genuine care, of real interest, of the specific ache that came from wanting someone to be well. He was in the territory of beginning to know someone and not wanting to stop. He drove home in the snow quiet and thought about shapes and what it meant to finally try to be your own. In late January, a man arrived in Marin's Hollow who didn't belong there. Marco noticed him on his morning run, a black SUV parked on the main road where cars didn't park, its engine off, but its windows foggy with occupant's breath. 2 men inside, maybe 3. He ran past without altering his pace or his direction, but every trained part of him catalogued: windows, plates, the angle of the vehicle, which gave a clear sightline to both the bed and breakfast and the hardware store. He ran the full route, came back. The SUV was gone. He spent the rest of the morning in a careful and controlled state of vigilance that he'd hoped to have put further behind him by now. He called Santoro at noon. Someone found me, he said without preamble. A pause on the other end that told him Santoro was not entirely surprised by this, which told him something. I need you to be honest with me. Marco, Enzo. He used the name carefully, the way you used a knife. I walked away clean. We both know that. If someone found me anyway, I need to know which direction they came from. Another pause. The Marchetti people. They've been... The incursion I mentioned. They're testing the new structure, looking for leverage. They think I'm leverage. They think you know things that give them leverage. Rosters, accounts, some of the federal arrangements. I don't carry that anymore. They don't believe that. He stood at the window of his room and looked at his plants, the 3 of them in their quiet winter patience, and thought about Elena 2 blocks away in her warm shop with her fabric and her shears, in the middle of something she had built carefully, with nothing to protect it but its smallness and its distance from anything that mattered to the kind of men who drove black SUVs. Handle it, he said. I don't need to know how. I need it handled without anything touching this town. Marco, if you wanted to come back temporarily... No. Flat and final. Handle it from there. This town stays clean. He hung up and sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands for a moment. Just a moment, allowing himself that much. Then he got up and made a plan. He was very good at making plans. It was one of the things he was best at and least proud of. He drove into the next town and bought, from a hardware store there, an additional 2 deadbolt locks and a specific kind of motion-triggered light for the exterior. He returned to the hollow after dark and installed the locks on the bed and breakfast doors. Doris, who asked no questions, allowed this with a look that suggested she had not survived 71 years by being unobservant, and he drove past Elena's shop and noted its entry points and proximity to the main road and parked outside it for 20 minutes in the dark, watching. Nothing. Nobody. The town was quiet. He was, perhaps, being too cautious. The Marchetti people were sending a message, not a strike team. But he had survived 26 years in the world he'd been in, partly because he treated the distinction between perhaps and certainly with the seriousness it deserved. He did not tell Elena. He struggled with this decision for 2 days before he understood why it was the right one. Not because she couldn't handle the information. She was clearly a woman who could handle difficult information with equanimity, but because telling her would require telling her what he was, and he was not ready for that yet. And he was afraid, if he was entirely honest, that Reddy was not a destination he would ever quite reach on his own. What he did instead was change his walking routes, vary his schedule, notice every vehicle in the hollow. He sat with his back to the wall in Patty's and watched the door, which he'd always done, but now did with specific intent. He trusted that Santoro would manage the Marchetti situation, because Santoro was careful, and because Marco had spent years ensuring that the organization could function without him, had, in fact, been planning his exit long enough to have built a machine that ran itself. On the 5th day after the SUV, he was at the creek path in the early morning dark when he heard someone behind him and turned with a speed and stillness that was pure muscle memory, his hand moving to his belt where, for 26 years, something had lived that was not there anymore. "It's me," said Elena's voice, from 5 feet back. He made himself uncoil. He stood in the dark path and breathed. She was in a heavy coat and boots, her hair wrapped in a scarf, holding a small thermos. She was looking at him with that clear-eyed assessment that he'd come to understand was not judgment, but attention. The look of someone trying to understand something accurately. "You do that," she said, "when something surprises you. You go very still and then very quick." "Old habit," he said. "From what?" A long pause. The creek moved in the dark beside them. Overhead, the winter sky was doing something extraordinary with the last stars. "From a life," he said, "that required it." She held out the thermos. "I make coffee at 5. I saw you run past. I thought you might want some." He took it. The warmth of it moved through his hands. He looked at her in the dark, her steady face, her particular lack of alarm. "Aren't you afraid of me?" he said. It came out more directly than he'd intended. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. "No," she said. "Should I be? I'm not the safest person to know." "You've been here 3 months," she said. "You helped an old man reorganize his hardware store. You grow plants. You leave a 20% tip every single time at Patty's, and I know because she tells everyone." A pause. "You're also wound very tight, and you watch every room like you're counting exits." "I'm not afraid of you. I'm curious about you. Those are different things." He stood in the cold dark with her thermos in his hands and felt something give way inside him, a small, structural yielding, a thing he hadn't known was still held rigid. "Elena," he said. "Marco," she said, equally. "I want to tell you things. I need more time. To understand how." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then take the time," she said. "I'll still be here." She walked back up the path toward the hollow. He watched her go, in the last dark before the morning, with her composed gait and her composed life, and he stood by the creek with her coffee thermos in his hands and understood that he was falling in love with her, completely and with no remaining doubt. February arrived with an ice storm that took out power to half the hollow for 36 hours. There was a tree across the Schraft Road, and the utility company truck couldn't get in until morning. The town gathered, as it did, in Patty's, which ran on a gas range and stayed open and warm. People brought food from their freezers, things that would spoil, and laid it out on the counter in an impractical potluck of crisis. Marco helped Doris, who walked with a slightly uncertain gait on ice, get to the diner. He carried a case of candles from the hardware store. He sat down, finally, next to Elena at the long table that had been pushed together from 4 small ones to make room for everyone, and the hollow ate together by candlelight while the ice came down outside. After the food, Patty brought out the whiskey, as was apparently traditional. Marco put his hand over his glass. "I don't drink," he said, easily, no explanation offered. Elena, to his left, had a small glass that she nursed over 2 hours. She was in conversation with Becca on her other side, and Marco was in conversation with Father Michael, who turned out to hold views on Kierkegaard that he had not been expecting from a small-town priest, and the evening moved with the pleasant unpredictability of good company under adverse conditions. At some point, past 10, the ice still coming down, nobody going anywhere, the conversations became quieter and more private as people paired off into the comfortable confidentiality that warmth and candlelight and small disasters produced. Elena turned to him. "Tell me something true," she said. It was not a demand, it was an invitation, with room to decline. He looked at her in the candlelight. She was beautiful like this. Not differently beautiful, just more visible somehow. the soft light finding the structure of her face. "I ran an organization," he said. He said it the way a man says a thing he's been holding for a long time, slowly, with intention. "For 26 years, in New York, a criminal organization." She was very still. "My family had been in it for 3 generations. I came into it knowing what it was and believing I could, that I would be different. Better." He paused. "I was better than some, worse than I'd meant to be." She held his gaze, did not move away, did not speak. "I stepped away 8 months ago. I transferred everything, all of it, to someone I trust. It took a year to arrange." He looked at the candle between them. "What I came here to do is, I wanted to find out if I could be something other than that, something simpler, something that didn't require—" He stopped. "Something that didn't require people to be afraid of you," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "The scar," she said, "the way you move, the way you watch a room." "Yes." A long silence. The ice was still tapping at the windows. Somewhere at the other end of the table, Franklin was telling a story that was making people laugh. "Are you in danger?" she asked, direct and unadorned. "There are people who would prefer I were accessible. I'm managing that." "Managing it how?" He looked at her. "The way I know how, quietly, from a distance." She absorbed this, turned her small glass in her hands. "Are you going to tell me you're different now?" "No," he said. "I'm the same person who did those things. I'm trying to use what I am, the things I know how to do, the things I notice, for better purposes. I'm not asking to be forgiven. I'm not even asking you to—" "Marco," she said quietly, "I'm not asking you to justify yourself to me. I asked you for something true. You gave me something true." She paused. "That's all I wanted." He stared at her. "I'm not going to pretend," she said, "that what you told me doesn't require sitting with. It does. I need to think about it." She looked at him with those steady eyes. "But I'm not afraid of you. I told you that before, and I still mean it." He did not know what to do with this. He had expected, he had prepared for, something more like rejection, or at least a pulling back, the reasonable response of a reasonable person to the news that the man at the Tuesday table had spent 26 years doing things that good people didn't do. Instead, she was sitting with him in candlelight and telling him she needed to think. "Why?" he said. "Why aren't you afraid?" She looked at him for a moment, and something softened in her expression. Not pity, not condescension, but something older and more serious, like compassion that had been through difficulty and come out the other side unchanged. "Because you came here with nothing to hide behind," she said. "You bought a coffee plant and started helping Bob with inventory and tipped 20% at Patty's. That's not the behavior of a man planning to stay dangerous. That's the behavior of a man trying very hard to become ordinary and failing in small ways and not giving up." He sat with that for a long moment. "I don't know if I deserve ordinary," he said. "I don't think it's about deserving," she said. "I think it's about whether you're willing to do the work of being something different." A pause. "You seem willing." The lights came back on at midnight, all at once, with the particular joylessness of institutional fluorescence after hours of warm candlelight. The room blinked and adjusted, and people began gathering coats and saying goodnights. Elena stood and put on her coat and wrapped her scarf. She looked at him, fully and directly, the way she looked at everything she was deciding what to do with. "Good night, Marco," she said. "Good night, Elena." She walked out into the cleared night, her boots finding the ice carefully, and he watched her go and thought that she was the bravest person he had met in a very long time. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd met the thing that might have frightened her, and chosen, with full information, to keep looking. March came in cold and left warm, the reliable duplicity of Allegheny Springs, and with the warmth came the feeling that things were shifting, that something long compressed was beginning to have room. Elena thought about what Marco had told her. She sat with it honestly, turned it over, measured it against what she knew of him, not the story but the man, the daily man, the one who watered his plants and helped old men with inventory and said good morning to the dogs on the creek path. She was not naive. She knew that men who did the kind of things Marco had done were complex in ways that simple good behavior couldn't entirely redeem. She knew there were people who had been hurt by decisions he'd made, and that those people existed outside her knowledge of him, and that she was not entitled to discount them. But she had also, in 42 years, developed a sharp sense for the difference between a man who had done harm and was now performing goodness for an audience, and a man who had done harm and was now genuinely trying to understand what he was and whether there was another version possible. Marco was the second. She was as certain of this as she was of anything. She did not tell him this right away. She let the knowing settle in her, become solid, become something she trusted. She went about her work, her Tuesdays at Patty's, her mornings at the shop, and she was perhaps marginally warmer to him, marginally less careful, in the way that a person who has made a decision can afford to be less careful about the thing they've decided. He noticed. He was a man who noticed everything. But he did not press, and she respected this very much. On the third Tuesday of March, she brought him something. It was not a dramatic gesture. She came to Patty's with a small potted olive tree, about 8 inches tall, in a terracotta pot, its leaves small and silver green and very much alive. She set it on the table between their coffee cups. "For your window," she said. "You have 3 plants. Odd numbers bother me." He looked at the small tree. Something moved across his face. He was better, she'd noticed, at hiding his face in public than in private. The private, Marco let things through more. "Why an olive tree?" "They're slow and they're old," she said, "and they outlive almost everything. Also, they're from where you're from." He picked up the pot and held it with the same careful gentleness he applied to everything small, and she thought, that's it. That's the thing that makes this possible. The gentleness. Not softness, he was not soft, but gentleness, which was different. Softness was the absence of hardness. Gentleness was a choice made in the presence of the capacity for hardness. He chose it, daily, deliberately. She had been falling for the gentleness since October. "Elena," he said, looking at the tree. "Marco," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what this is." "Good," she said. "I'm not in the habit of pretending." He looked up from the tree. "I want to be honest with you about everything. There are things... I can't always tell you everything right away. Some of it is still... active. But I'm not going to lie to you." "I know," she said. "You've never lied to me. That's why we're having this conversation." He set the small olive tree down on the table and looked at her across it, and in the morning light of Patty's diner, with the coffee machine running, and Franklin at the counter with his dogs tied outside, and the whole small, ordinary world of Marin's Hollow doing its ordinary business around them, something passed between them that needed no decoration. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not here, somewhere properly, if there's a somewhere within range." "There's a restaurant in Clearfield," she said. "It's not much, but it's not Patty's." "Friday?" he said. "Friday," she said. She went back to the shop with her empty hands and her full chest, and stood at the work table for a full minute before she was able to pick up a needle, and Volta, who had never in his life deigned to comfort anyone, wove once around her ankles in what she chose to interpret as encouragement. The dinner in Clearfield was an event, only in the way that quiet things were events, in the depth of them, not the display. They drove through the darkened hills with the easy silence of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms, and the restaurant was small, and the food was decent, and the wine was acceptable, and none of that was the point. The point was the 2 hours in which she learned things about him that she hadn't known, and he learned things about her, and neither of them performed. They just talked, the way 2 people talk when they have decided to let each other in. He told her about Naples, the real version. His father, a man who had been, Marco said quietly, capable of great warmth and terrible cruelty in proportions that never became predictable. The way the organization had seemed, from the outside of it when you were a boy, like power and clarity and belonging, and the way it had felt, from the inside of it when you were a man, like a house you'd moved into before you understood the architecture and couldn't find your way out of. She told him about Philadelphia, about the marriage, about Daniel, good Daniel, and the way she had spent 7 years feeling invisible, in the way that a very specific shape feels invisible when the space it lives in is the wrong dimensions. About driving until she found Marin's Hollow and feeling, for the first time in years, that the air around her was the right size. "You built something here," he said. "I did," she said. "I'm proud of it." "You should be." He said it simply, without embellishment, the way someone said a true thing. On the way back, the Allegheny dark was absolute around the headlights, and the stars were extravagant overhead, and she reached across the center console and put her hand over his where it rested on the gear shift. His hand turned over beneath hers, his fingers laced through hers. They drove in silence the rest of the way home, and it was the most complete silence she had ever been in. The man arrived on a Tuesday in late March when Elena was in the shop alone. She knew immediately that he was wrong for the Hollow. He was too composed, too city-wise, wearing a coat that cost too much in a town where a coat was for warmth and nothing else. He was perhaps 50, with a quality of pleasant menace that she recognized. She had grown up in a neighborhood that produced this quality, as the affect of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a room. "I'm looking for a man named Marco Vitale," he said, from the doorway. He had not come inside. He stood at the threshold with his hands in his coat pockets. Elena set down her shears. "Never heard of him," she said. The man looked at her for a moment with that assessing, unhurried quality. "He may be going by another name. Italian, early 40s. "I understand Italian," she said, in Italian, which she spoke moderately well from her grandmother's teaching, and she held the man's gaze with the flat calm of a woman who had decided something. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not quite respect, calculation perhaps. "You're his woman," he said. "I'm a seamstress," she said. "Good morning." She held his gaze until he nodded, once, minimally, and left. She waited until she heard the car drive away. Then she called Marco. He answered on the second ring. "A man was just here," she said, "looking for Marco Vitale." A silence that told her everything. "Are you safe?" he said. "Yes, he's gone. I'll be there in 5 minutes." "Marco." She kept her voice level. "I'm fine. Come when you're ready." He came in 4 minutes, which meant he ran. He came through the door of the shop, and his face was... She had not seen his face like this before. Not alarmed, exactly, but intensely present in a way that all the usual careful control had been stripped from, and what was underneath it was a man who was genuinely afraid for her. "I'm fine," she said again, quietly. He stood in the middle of the shop and breathed, and she watched him put himself back together. Not the hard way, not the full armor, just find his steadiness. It took perhaps 30 seconds. "I'm sorry," he said. "This was what I was afraid of. I thought I'd managed." "Sit down," she said. She made tea. It was what she did. He sat at the work table, and she made tea, and they sat across from each other, and she told him what the man had said and done, accurately and without editorializing. When she was finished, he said, "His name is Dario Marchetti. He runs a family out of Philadelphia. They've been trying to establish that I'm still accessible, that I have information they can use." "Do you?" "I have information," he said. "I always will. That doesn't go away." He paused. "What I have more of is the kind of contacts that make people like Marchetti very nervous if they push too hard." "Is he going to push too hard?" "No," Marco said. And the way he said it, not threatening, not boasting, just certain. The certainty of a man who understood the full geometry of the situation. She believed him completely. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say?" "Most people would." He stopped. "You're extraordinary. Do you know that?" "I'm practical," she said. "There's a difference." "In my experience," he said, slowly, "they're the same thing in the people who matter." She looked at him across the table. His face was still open, still unguarded in the way it had been when he first came in, the composed exterior not fully restored. She found she preferred it. Not the openness as distress, the openness as reality. Just Marco, actually present, without the careful management. "He'll leave," she said. "He'll leave. And then?" "And then it's done. The structure I left, Santoro will manage this." Marchetti's going to find that pressing on my absence is considerably more costly than accepting it. She nodded. She picked up her shears. Then I have bridesmaid dresses to finish. He watched her pick up her work with something on his face that she couldn't fully name but felt, from the inside, like being seen. Like being the specific shape of herself and having someone see that shape clearly and stay. He came back that evening, after the shop was closed. He knocked, and she let him in, and they sat in her kitchen above the shop, with her good olive oil and her grandmother's bread recipe that she'd baked on Sunday, and a late dinner that was simple and unhurried. I need you to have my number, he said, specifically, not just the usual way. My actual reach number, the one that connects regardless. She looked at him. He was holding his phone across the table. If anything ever feels wrong, he said, you call me first, before anything else. I will be wherever you are in, he considered the distances of the hollow, in minutes. Marco, she said. I know you're capable, he said. This isn't doubt about your capability. This is me needing... He stopped, looked at the table. I haven't had anything I needed to protect in a very long time. I've been very careful not to. And now I have something, and I need you to let me do this one thing. She took his phone. She added herself to his contacts, not under her full name, but under E, simple and clean. She handed it back and gave him her number in return. Okay, she said. Okay, he said, and exhaled. They finished dinner. He helped her clean up. He left at 10, and she walked him to the door. And at the door, he turned and looked at her, and then, slowly, with a deliberateness that gave her every opportunity to step back, he put his hand against her face, one large, careful hand, against her cheek, and looked at her. She put her hand over his. They stood like that for a moment in the doorway. Good night, he said. Good night, she said. She watched him walk down the stairs and out into the spring night, and she leaned in the doorframe with her hand against her own cheek, where his warmth still lived. She was, she thought, completely lost. She was also, strangely and completely, fine with that. The hollow changed in April with the slow, trustworthy certainty of a place that had done this every year and knew how. Green came back to the ridges from the top down. The creek ran loud and cold with snowmelt. The dogs on the creek path came back from their winter mud as something brighter, and Franklin began his walks half an hour earlier with the return of the light. Marco's room at Doris's had become, over the months, genuinely his, not just occupied, but inhabited. The windowsill plants had multiplied. He had added the olive tree, which Elena's small olive tree had inspired him to find a larger version of, and a rosemary plant that he tended with what he recognized as an entirely disproportionate level of care for a culinary herb. Doris had, at some point in January, moved a second bookshelf into the room without comment, and he had filled it with the books he'd been buying from the used bookstore in Clearfield. History, mostly, and architecture, and one impulsive purchase of a book on Italian cooking that he had not yet done anything with, but that he intended to. He was beginning to be able to imagine a future that was specific rather than merely theoretical. He was careful with Elena. This was the right word. Not cautious in the fearful sense, but careful in the sense of a man who understood the value of what he was being given and did not want to damage it through haste or assumption. He knew, with the clarity he had developed for self-knowledge in these months of honest living, that his history created a gravitational pull towards certain patterns: possession, control, the management of risk through preemptive action. He had spent 26 years in an environment that rewarded those patterns lavishly. He did not trust himself entirely not to default to them. He talked to Doris about this. This was not something he'd planned. It arose one evening when he was helping her with the accounts. She had accepted his help with the bed and breakfast's books in February, an area where his considerable experience with moving large amounts of money proved, in scaled-down form, genuinely useful. And she had looked at him over the spreadsheet with those sharp old eyes and said, "You've got it for Elena." He didn't insult her by pretending he didn't know what she meant. Yes, good woman, Doris said. Deserves someone who'll pay attention. I pay a great deal of attention, he said, dry. That's not what I mean. She closed the laptop. She's been very careful with herself since she came here, which was the right thing to do, for a while. But she's been careful longer than she needs to be, and she knows it, and she won't change without a reason. She looked at him. You're a reason. He thought about this for a long time that night. He was a reason. He was also, he thought, a complication. A man with a past that had tentacles, with the residual gravity of a life in which people had moved around him as if around a fixed and powerful mass. He had tried, in these months, to release that gravity, to make himself lighter, less central, less determining, to be a person in a place rather than a force in a system. He was, he thought, doing better at it. He brought Elena dinner on a Wednesday, in the first warm week of April. Not at a restaurant. He brought it to her. He had, against all prior self-conception, cooked it himself from the Italian cookbook, with additional guidance from a video that he was not going to mention to anyone. Braised chicken thighs with olives and capers, and the particular richness of something slow-cooked by someone who was doing it for the first time and paying very close attention. He knocked on her shop door at 7, when the sign had been turned to closed, and she opened it, looking faintly astonished. You cooked, she said, looking at the container in his hands. Poorly, he said. Probably. She let him in, and they ate at her kitchen table, while the spring dark came down outside, and the creek ran loud in the distance, and Volta, having decided he approved of whatever was in the container, stationed himself at Marco's feet. The food was not poorly done. It was imperfect in ways that first attempts were imperfect, slightly over-reduced, one dish that needed more lemon. But it was real, made with care and intention, and she ate it with genuine pleasure, and said so directly, which he had learned was her way. She did not perform appreciation, which meant that when she expressed it, it meant everything it said. You've been practicing, she said, every night this week. A pause. I had the time and the books. She looked at him across the small table. You're doing something on purpose, she said, not quite smiling. What is it? Building a life, he said, simply, directly, because simple and direct was what she deserved and what he had. Trying to understand how to be in a place properly. How to give something instead of... He stopped, found the words. Instead of occupying space and expecting things to organize around me. She was quiet for a moment. That must have been a very particular world, she said, if that's how it worked. It was, he said. It was a world I understood completely and that I couldn't live in anymore. And this world? I'm learning, he said, slowly, but I think I'm learning. After dinner, they sat in her front room. She had lit the lamps, and the room was warm and particular with the smell of her plants and her fabrics and the specific quality of a space where someone had been making things for years. And she showed him the Morrison wedding dress, which was nearly complete. He had seen fabric and construction all winter, but this was different. The dress was white silk organza over a lining of heavy cream satin, the bodice hand-stitched with a pattern of small seed pearls that Elena had worked in the last 6 weeks, one by one, with a patience that he found almost incomprehensible. How many hours? He said. I stopped counting, she said. You stop counting when you love the work. He looked at her profile, at the line of her concentration as she pointed out details of the construction, explaining choices. Why this seam instead of that? Why the particular weight of the organza here over a lighter fabric there? She was, when she talked about work, incandescent in a quiet way. The way certain people were incandescent in the thing they were built for. I want to stay, he said, into a pause. It came out without the architecture he'd meant to give it. Just the simple, true fact of it. She looked at him. In the hollow, he clarified. I'd like to find a house. If I'm going to stay, I should not keep imposing on Doris indefinitely. Doris would never call it imposing. No, he agreed, but I'd like something of my own. He held her gaze. Something here. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes, and then she said, There's a property on the Callaway end of Birch, the Holt House. The Holts moved to Florida 2 years ago. It's been empty. I've seen it, he said. He'd been seeing it for weeks. It has a good kitchen, she said. I know, he said. She smiled then, fully, not the small, controlled curve, but actually, warmly, with her whole face, and he felt it in the center of his chest like a light coming on. Then you should talk to the Holts, she said. The Holt house was a 1920s craftsman that had been added to twice and improved in ways that were sometimes sympathetic and sometimes not. It had a deep front porch, a kitchen with windows on 3 sides, a living room with a fireplace of original fieldstone, and out back, a half-acre that had once been a kitchen garden and was now returning to itself in the way that untended good soil did. Not messily, but purposefully, the bulbs of spring finding their way up through 2 years' worth of leaves. Marco bought it on a Thursday in late April. He did not, this time, consult anyone about the price. It was fair by any measure, and he paid it without negotiation, which surprised the Holt's agent and did not surprise Elena, who understood by now that Marco's relationship to money was the relationship of a man who had once had too much of it and had learned that the only things worth spending it on were things that lasted. He spent May making it his. This was, he understood, the most domestic project of his life. He had owned houses before, the Manhattan penthouse, the Naples villa, but owning and inhabiting were different activities, and what he was doing now, in the Holt house on the corner of Birch and Calloway, was inhabiting. He made choices about the space with the careful attention he had previously reserved for strategy, where the light fell in the morning and whether the furniture used it or wasted it, how the kitchen smelled with the herbs he planted in the window boxes, whether the fieldstone fireplace needed mortar in the 3rd course from the left. It did. Bob Schraft helped him fix it one Saturday with a patience that Marco received as friendship. Elena came over for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in the 2nd week of May. He had asked carefully, framed it as a second opinion on the living room arrangement, because her eye was better than his, and because he wanted her in the space. She stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at it. The arrangement of the furniture he'd acquired, simple and good, nothing performative. A couch and 2 chairs and the books on the shelves and his plants lined up along the south-facing windowsill in their terracotta pots. And she was quiet for a moment. It looks like you, she said. Is that good? Yes, she said. It looks exactly like who you're trying to be. He showed her the kitchen, which was his pride, if he allowed himself that word. He had planted herbs in every possible window box, and had hung copper pots of the kind his mother had used, and the whole space had the particular quality of a room that had been organized for the purpose of making food, not displaying the fact that one owned a kitchen. You're really doing this, she said, from the kitchen doorway. I'm really doing this, he confirmed. She looked at him across the kitchen. The afternoon light came through 3 windows, and she was in the middle of it, in her dark cardigan with the measuring tape she'd forgotten, again, around her neck like always, and she looked like something he did not have a word for in any language he knew. He crossed the kitchen. He was very deliberate about this. No sudden movements, nothing that required her to respond before she'd chosen to. He stood in front of her, and she looked up at him with her clear, direct eyes. I'm going to be very straightforward, he said, about what I want. Good, she said. I prefer straightforward. I want to be with you, he said. In whatever way you're comfortable with, and at whatever pace makes sense to you. I'm not going anywhere. I don't have anywhere I need to be except here. A pause. That's new for me. I want you to understand that it's true. She reached up and put her hand flat against his chest, centered over his heart, a clear and purposeful gesture. I know, she said. I've been watching you for 7 months, Marco. I know who you're trying to be. She held his gaze. I want that person. I want to be with that person. He put his hand over hers. The warmth between them was... He kissed her. Not tentatively. He had never done anything tentatively in his life, and he was not going to start now with the first thing that had mattered to him in 20 years. He kissed her with all the intention he had, with all the care, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and the afternoon light filled the kitchen around them. When they separated, she kept her hand on his chest, and he kept both hands at her waist, and they stood in his kitchen in the May afternoon and breathed. Dinner? She said. I'll cook, he said. She laughed, fully, warmly, the laugh he had been hearing in pieces since October and was only now getting all of. It was extraordinary. "Of course you will," she said, and she went to sit at his kitchen table, and he went to the refrigerator, and outside the hollow was green and warm, and the creek ran quietly through the afternoon, and Marco Vitale, formerly of the most powerful crime family between New York and Chicago, stood in his own kitchen in a small Pennsylvania town and cooked dinner for the woman he loved. He thought, briefly, of all the things he had owned and done and been in his life. This was better. This was the thing he had been looking for without knowing its shape. There was a night in June when he told her more. They had fallen, by then, into the easy rhythm of people who have decided to share their lives without having made any announcement about it. Dinners at his house or hers, walks in the morning that were no longer accidental but deliberate, the quiet back and forth of two people learning each other's specific weight in the world. He had not told her everything. He didn't know if he ever would, entirely. Some things lived in him like old shrapnel, present, occasionally painful, not removable without doing more damage than they caused. But he had told her more and more, over weeks, in the way that people who trusted each other told things. Not all at once in a confessional rush, but in the daily increments of shared history. She listened in the way she did everything, fully and without flinching, and without the particular performing of non-judgment that was worse than judgment because it was dishonest. On this night in June, they were on the porch of the Holt house in the warm dark, and he told her about Cesare. He had told no one about Cesare except Santoro, and that had been a practical conversation. What happened, what was done to address it, what it cost the organization in credibility, and what it cost Marco in something that didn't have an organizational name. He had never told anyone what it had cost him in sleep, or in the very specific shape of the self-knowledge he now carried. He told Elena. He told her in full, without excision, without the tactical elisions he'd spent a career perfecting. A man accused. The information that had seemed conclusive. The order given in a building on a cold December night. The truth that had emerged 3 months later from the very informant Cesare had been accused of talking to, who had, in the end, broken and talked, and whose first information had been, Cesare was loyal. Cesare didn't know anything. He told her about the money he'd sent to Cesare's wife, Marta, who had a daughter named Julia, who would now be 22, and the letter he'd written and never sent, in his notebook, 17 revisions and counting. He told her about what it had done to him, how it had been the weight that finally made the whole structure of his former life unlivable. How you could carry the others, the men who'd made choices, who'd known the rules and accepted them, but how the weight of the one who hadn't had choices was a different weight entirely. Elena was quiet for a long time after he finished. "Send the letter," she said, finally. He looked at her. "Marta," she said, "send the letter, not because it fixes anything, because not sending it is about your comfort, and sending it is about hers." A pause. "She might not want to hear it. She might throw it away, but you should give her the choice." He sat with this. "You've been carrying this as something unspeakable," Elena said, "and the unspeakability is making it heavier. Say the words, even on paper, even to someone who might not read them." He looked at the dark ridges above the hollow, the summer stars finding their places in the sky. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," she said, dry, and put her head against his shoulder. They sat on the porch until the night got cold, and he felt, in the sitting, something he hadn't expected. Not resolution, that wasn't available, and he didn't pretend it was, but the particular relief of having been known. Fully known, the difficult parts included, and held in that knowledge by someone who did not look away. He sent the letter in July, the 18th draft. He sent it to Santoro with instructions to route it through channels that would confirm to Marta that it was genuine and untraceable by anyone who might use it against her. He did not expect a reply. He did not ask for one. 2 months later, Santoro called to tell him that a letter had arrived from Naples, addressed to an account they used. He read it late at night in the kitchen of the Holt house, alone, with his olive tree in the window and the herb boxes fragrant in the summer air, and he read what Marta had to say. She had things to say, many of them angry, some of them simply grief, and at the end of the anger and the grief, 8 sentences in her careful schoolgirl Italian, telling him that Julia was doing well, that she was studying architecture in Rome, that Cesare had loved architecture, and this felt like something. Marco sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then he got up and watered his plants, all of them, even the ones that didn't need it yet, and he called Elena. "I got a letter back," he said when she answered. A pause. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened without interrupting. "How do you feel?" she said when he finished. He thought about it honestly. "Like something stopped pressing," he said. "Not gone, not forgiven, just not pressing anymore." "That's enough," she said. "That's sufficient for one night." "Come over," he said. She did. It was August when the second complication arrived, and this one was more personal than the first. Her name was Valentina Rossi, and she had been, for 3 years in Marco's mid-40s, the closest thing to a relationship he'd had since Carla, which was to say, significant, real, and ending in a way that was nobody's fault except the specific fault of the life he'd been living. Valentina was brilliant and beautiful and had understood what he was and loved him anyway, right up until she hadn't been able to anymore, and he had let her go with the particular pain of a man who knew he was right to do it and did it anyway. She arrived in Marin's Hollow on a Wednesday morning, which told him she was serious. Nobody came to Marin's Hollow accidentally. She had gone to some effort to find him. She was as he remembered, tall, dark-haired, with the Italian elegance that was bred rather than constructed, wearing the kind of clothes that traveled well because they were made correctly. She was 42 years old now, and she was more of what she'd always been, which was to say, formidable. She found him at Bob's hardware store, where he was doing his Thursday inventory. He'd lost track of days. It was, in fact, Thursday. And she stood in the doorway with her city coat and her city shoes, and she looked at him across the stacked shelves of fasteners and said in Italian, "You look different." "I am different," he said, also in Italian, and meant it literally. Bob Schraft, who had retired to the back office with the tact of a man who had observed the arrival and correctly assessed it as requiring privacy, made a pointed sound of general busyness from behind a closed door. Marco led Valentina to the small bench outside the store, and they sat in the August warmth, and she told him why she'd come. It was not, as he'd first suspected, about the organization or the Marchetti problem. It was about something more immediate. She had, in the time since they'd separated, built a life that was now in a specific and serious danger. A man she had testified against had not volunteered testimony, but had been compelled, which was different and worse in certain communities, was about to be released from prison, and she was afraid. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "What do you need?" "I need the name of someone who can help me disappear the way you disappeared," she said. "I have the means. I don't have the structure." "I can make a call," he said. "I know people who do exactly this. Cleanly." "That's all I'm asking," she said. He looked at her. 26 years of being what he was, and here was the residue. A brilliant woman who'd loved him, now sitting on a bench in a Pennsylvania town, asking for the one kind of help that only a man with his particular history could provide. "I'll make the call today," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're happy here," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm building something," he said. "I think it might turn out to be happiness." She nodded once, with a quality of acceptance that he recognized as the kind that cost something. "Good," she said. "You always needed to build something. You just had the wrong materials for too long." He walked her to her car. She kissed him on both cheeks in the Italian manner and drove away. He stood in the street for a moment after her car turned out of sight, and then he went to find Elena. He found her at Patty's, where she'd gone for her Tuesday coffee. It was Thursday, which he kept forgetting. And she was sitting alone at their corner table, with a coffee and a sketchbook, working on something. She looked up when he came in. She read his face in the 3 seconds it took him to cross the diner. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. He told her about Valentina, start to finish, leaving nothing out. Not the 3 years, not the ending, not what Valentina had asked, not what he'd agreed to provide. Elena listened. She was quiet when he finished, looking at her sketchbook, and he waited, because rushing her had never been his mistake with Elena, and he was not going to make it now. "You were going to tell me anyway," she said, even before you came in here. Yes, he said. Of course. You didn't have to, she said. It was a separate thing, old history. I want you to know everything that moves in my vicinity, he said. Not because I think you need protection. You don't, not from information. But because... He stopped, found the words. Because the life I'm trying to build here is built on you knowing everything. The moment I start calculating what to tell you, it becomes a different kind of thing. She looked at him then, fully, with those dark eyes. Okay, she said. Okay? She needed help. You helped her. You told me. She returned to her sketchbook. That's what decent people do. He sat across from her in Patty's diner and watched her sketch. It was a new pattern, something architectural in the construction, with pleats she was working out in graphite. And he thought that he had spent 26 years surrounded by people who were loyal out of obligation or fear, and he had never understood until now what it felt like to be with someone who was simply, plainly good, who made goodness look easy because they'd had it long enough for it to settle into habit. He was not good, not entirely. He was trying, but he was trying next to someone who made it worth trying for. By September, the town of Marin's Hollow knew. This was, of course, inevitable. 400 souls in a hollow surrounded by hills. The town knew everything, eventually. It knew that Marco Voss had bought the Holt house and installed herb boxes in the kitchen windows, and had been seen, on multiple occasions, carrying things from Elena's shop to his house. It knew that his car was frequently in front of her building in the evenings, and that they had been seen at Patty's, not at separate tables, but at the same table, which was the town's official designation for a couple. The town's response was, characteristically, practical. Patty began putting 2 cups on the corner table preemptively. Franklin began greeting them together on the creek path, with the golden retrievers, who approved of Marco on the evidence of enthusiastic tail-wagging. Bob Schraft, who was the closest thing Marco had to a friend in the uncomplicated sense, said absolutely nothing, which was his highest form of approval. Father Michael, who knew more about human nature than most people who hadn't spent years in a confessional, told Elena in passing one Sunday morning that she seemed very well, and meant several layers of things with it. Doris Schraft said, to Marco, at dinner one Thursday, "About time." He laughed. He genuinely laughed, which still surprised him, the ease of it. "I'm aware," he said. "She's been careful for a long time," Doris said. "You understand that means something." "I understand it means everything," he said. What he was building with Elena was not the kind of love he had understood in his former life, that high-pressure, high-stakes, weapons-grade emotion that his world had traded in. Love as territory, love as leverage, love as the soft underbelly men tried to hide. What he was building was something slower and more interesting. It was built from Tuesday mornings and Thursday dinners and the particular gravity of 2 people who had decided to be in the same orbit. It was built from her telling him about the technical problem of inserting a complicated lining into a wool coat, and him listening with genuine attention because the problem was interesting and because she was interesting. It was built from him telling her about the books he was reading, the architecture book, the Italian cooking book, a history of the Allegheny mountain towns that he'd found in the used bookstore and found himself unexpectedly moved by, and her asking questions that showed she had been paying attention to the things he mentioned. It was built from the morning in September when he found her asleep on her workroom couch, surrounded by pattern pieces, having worked through most of the night on something that needed to be done by morning. And he made coffee and brought it to her and sat in the armchair while she woke up, and she took the coffee from him with her eyes still barely open and said, "What time is it?" And he said, 6. And she said, "I need 20 minutes. And he said, "Take 30, and sat and waited, and thought he had never been this comfortable anywhere in his life. It was built from small things, and it was the most structurally sound thing he had ever been part of. There was a Sunday in mid-September when Elena's sister called. Marco had not known about Elena's sister specifically. He knew there was family in Philadelphia, that the relationship was complicated in the way family relationships were complicated when a person had moved away from everything to start over. He heard the call from the kitchen, where he was making dinner, and he could hear, without making out words, the cadence of a difficult conversation. She came into the kitchen after 20 minutes with a composed face and a tightness around her eyes that he recognized as a held emotion. "Everything all right?" he said. "My sister thinks I've disappeared," Elena said. She picked up a glass of water and drank some. "From my own life. I have apparently not called enough, not visited enough, and now I'm apparently in a relationship with a strange man that nobody knows anything about." A pause. Her words, "strange man." He looked at her. "Would you like me to be less strange?" The corner of her mouth moved. "I would like you to come to Philadelphia with me at some point, and be exactly what you are, which will be sufficient." He set down his spoon. "You want me to meet your family?" "I want my family to stop worrying," she said. "Meeting you will accomplish that, because you are—" She waved her hand, seeking the word. "Strange," he offered. "Grounding," she said. "You're very grounding, actually. Imposing and grounding. My sister will understand immediately." He thought about this. "When?" "October," she said. "I'll book it." He nodded. He picked up his spoon and returned to the stove. "Marco," she said. My mother's there too." He stopped stirring. "Your mother? She's 71. She's very direct. She'll ask you things. Things. About your life, your intentions, whether you own property." "I own property," he said. "I know. I'll brief her." He turned and looked at her. She was sitting on the counter with her water glass, watching him with the slight warmth in her eyes that meant she was amused and not showing it fully. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been considering it," she said. "There's a difference." He went back to the stove. He thought about meeting a family. He had not met a family in this sense in his life, had never reached the point with anyone where family was an appropriate consideration. He thought about Elena's mother, who was 71 and direct. He thought about what she might ask him and what he might honestly say. He found, to his own surprise, that he was not afraid of this. He was something adjacent to afraid, alive to it, alert to what it meant, but not afraid. He was, he thought, finally living in the right direction. The 1-year mark came in October without announcement, as a year's end often does, quietly, recognized only in retrospect. Marco stood on the porch of the Holt house in the early morning of the 4th of October and thought, "A year ago I drove into this town and didn't know what I was looking for." The maple trees on Birch and Callaway were doing October again, and they were magnificent, red and gold and the specific amber that existed only in the fall Alleghenies, and the cold air had the particular smell of wood smoke and cooling earth that he had come to identify as home. He was, he thought, home. The word sat differently than it had ever sat. Not the word he'd used for the Manhattan penthouse, which was a station, or the Naples villa, which was a heritage, or the Montana ranch, which was an aspiration he'd abandoned. This word, attached to this specific house on this specific corner, had roots. He went inside and made coffee and watered his plants, 7 of them now, on various windowsills, including a small lemon tree he'd acquired in August from a nursery in State College, and that Elena had said was either very ambitious or very optimistic, and he had said he was choosing to be both. At 7, he walked to Elena's shop. He had a key now, which she had given him in August with the same matter-of-fact directness she applied to everything. The shop was already lit. She was at the work table, with a coffee and a length of deep blue silk, and Volta was in the armchair, conducting his usual surveillance of the room. "October," he said, from the doorway. She looked up. "October," she confirmed. He came in. He sat across from her. He put a small box on the work table between them, not large, not performative, the right size for what was inside. She looked at it, then at him. "What did you do?" "Open it," he said. She opened it. Inside, on a small cushion of dark velvet, was a needle, a specific needle, a couture hand-sewing needle of a particular length and gauge that she had mentioned, once, in passing, was increasingly difficult to source. He had spent 3 weeks finding them through a supplier in Lyon, France, who specialized in dressmakers' equipment. She looked at the needle for a moment. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything you tell me," he said. "That's another thing that's true." She picked up the needle and examined it with the careful attention of someone for whom such objects were genuinely significant. Then she set it on the velvet and looked at him. "I made you something," she said. She produced from under the table a folded piece of cloth. She handed it across to him. He unfolded it. It was a shirt, a proper dress shirt, white with a faint cream stripe visible only in the light, tailored to exactly his measurements. Not a jacket this time, not an overcoat, but a shirt, the most intimate garment, the thing closest to the skin. The construction was impeccable. He could see, having watched her work for a year, the places where she had been most careful. The flat-felled seams, the hand-stitched collar, the buttons that matched, really matched, in material and spirit, the nature of the fabric. He held it in his hands and felt the weight of what she had made. "Put it on," she said, quietly. He did. He stood in the middle of her workroom and changed into her shirt, and she straightened the collar with both hands, precise and gentle, and then stepped back. "Good," she said. He looked down at himself, at the shirt, at the way it fit, the way she always made things fit. Exactly, precisely, in recognition of the specific shape of what you were. "Elena," he said. "Marco," she said. He took her hands in his. He held them for a moment, looking at her. The morning light, the dark eyes, the measuring tape around her neck, the small constellation of pin marks on her left sleeve. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "Not now. I'm going to ask you something, and I'm going to do it properly, with time and intention. But I wanted you to know it's coming." He held her gaze. "I want you to have time to think about it clearly." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very bright. "I don't need much time," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm giving you the time anyway, because you deserve to be asked carefully." She pressed his hands once and then stepped back and picked up her coffee. "Will it be before or after Philadelphia?" she said. "After," he said. "I want to ask your mother properly." She laughed, that full, warm laugh that he had fallen in love with before he knew it was happening. "She's going to give you a very intense cross-examination." "I've been cross-examined by federal prosecutors," he said. "I'll survive your mother." She smiled, and he smiled, and the morning light came through the windows of her shop and fell on the bolts of fabric and the dressmaker's forms and the armchair where he'd sat the first day and watched her hands. And the town of Marin's Hollow went about its Tuesday morning outside, and for once in his life, Marco Vitali was exactly where he was supposed to be. There was a night in November when it mattered. He had been careful for a year. He had managed the Marchetti situation through Santoro, who had managed it through the kind of quiet, structural pressure that didn't require anyone to be hurt. Marchetti had competing interests, competing debts, competing obligations, and those had been activated with precision until the interest in Marco's location had been crowded out by more immediate concerns. He had believed it was handled. He was wrong. The man who came was not Marchetti himself, and not one of his principals. He was a contractor, a freelance element of the kind that dangerous men sometimes used when they wanted distance from an outcome. He arrived late on a November Tuesday, when the hollow was dark and cold, and nearly everyone was inside. He arrived at Elena's shop. Marco was at the Holt house and heard nothing until his phone rang. The direct number, the one she had, and the call showed her name. And he answered it and heard nothing but background sound, her phone apparently calling his accidentally or not accidentally, and in the background he heard a voice that was not hers and the particular acoustic of her shop door closing. He was out the door in 45 seconds. He moved through the dark of November Marin's Hollow with the speed and silence of a man who had spent 26 years in situations that required speed and silence, and the year of mornings and coffee plants and hardware store Thursdays had not touched that part of him, and he was grateful for it now with a cold and complete gratitude. He came in through the back door of the shop with the key she had given him, and he came in quietly. The man was at the front of the shop. He was perhaps 35, broad, with the particular blank professionalism of someone doing a job. He had Elena's arm and was telling her, in a low, controlled voice, that this would go better if she would please confirm certain information. Elena was standing very still in the grip of the man's hand on her arm, and her face was, he saw this in the half-second of assessment before he moved, completely composed. not frozen with fear, composed, deliberate. She was listening, and she was waiting for something. She was waiting for him. Marco crossed the shop in 4 steps. What followed was not dramatic, in the sense that violence between trained people was rarely dramatic. It was efficient, it was complete, and it was over in approximately 40 seconds. The man was competent. Marco was better, with 26 years of better. He did not hurt the man more than necessary, which was a discipline he had always maintained even when he had been the most dangerous kind of version of himself. He used exactly the force that the situation required, and no more. The man was on the floor of the shop, incapacitated but uninjured in any permanent way, zip-tied with the ties Elena produced from her tool cabinet, with the presence of mind that he would later think about for a long time. Marco stood between Elena and the man on the floor and turned to look at her. She was straightening her cardigan. Her face was very pale, but her eyes were clear. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was very level. He was doing the same thing he asked her to do, keeping himself steady so she had something steady to orient to. "Yes," she said. "He touched your arm." "I'm all right, Marco." She looked at the man on the floor with an expression he could only describe as clinical. "Is he going to be a problem?" "No," he said. "He's going to be managed. But I need to make calls. Can you give me an hour?" "I can give you an hour." He made the calls. He made them from the back room, quickly, to Santoro and to 2 other people who knew how to remove problems of this specific variety from situations that needed to stay clean. The man on the floor would be collected and would be made to understand, in terms he could not misinterpret, that this particular avenue had no future. The calls took 32 minutes. When he came back into the front of the shop, Elena was at the work table with a cup of tea, and Volta, who had, apparently, been present for the entire incident and had expressed his opinion by retreating to the armchair, was in her lap. She looked up at him. "Done?" she said. "Done," he said. He sat across from her. She pushed a second cup of tea toward him. He wrapped his hands around it and looked at her across the work table. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "What I did just now," he said, "is the last thing I will ever do in that capacity. I am calling Santoro tomorrow and closing the last connection. There is nothing left, not Marchetti, not the organization, nothing that justifies any further reach into my life or yours." She held his gaze. "This town, this house, you, these are the things I'm protecting now, with everything I am." He paused. "I am not sorry for what I know how to do. It kept you safe tonight. But I'm done being a man who is known for it." She looked at him for a long time. "You've been done for a year," she said. "Tonight was the last echo." "Yes." "Then it's done," she said simply. He looked at her, the woman who had been in her shop alone at night and had stood still and waited for him, had had the presence of mind to call his number even in the grip of a frightening situation, had produced zip ties from her tool cabinet with the calm practicality of a woman who understood the difference between the things that could be controlled and the things that required other people. "You called me," he said. "You have the direct number," she said. "That's what it's for." He reached across the work table and took her hand. She turned hers over and let his fingers through, and they sat in the quiet shop in the November dark and held on to each other. And he thought that he had been afraid of many things in his life, and would be afraid of more in whatever life remained to him. But he was not afraid of this. He was not afraid of her. He was afraid, only and entirely, of losing her, which was the most honest fear he had ever had, and the most human. He took her to Philadelphia in late November, as planned. Her mother, Lucia Vasquez, was 69. Elena had been slightly off in her estimate, and she had the particular quality of women who have outlasted difficulties, a compact solidity, a directness that required no cushioning, and eyes exactly like her daughter's, dark and clear and entirely uninterested in performance. She served them dinner herself, a meal of painstaking effort and obvious love that Marco recognized and honored by eating carefully and complimenting the specific things that deserved to be complimented. He was good at this. He had spent 26 years in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong time had consequences, and the right word, noticed and specific, could change everything. Lucia noticed that he noticed. The cross-examination occurred after dinner, in the kitchen, where Elena's sister Sophia had conveniently arranged to need help with the dishes and had physically removed Elena from the dining room, leaving Marco alone with her mother and a cup of coffee that was very good. "You are older than my daughter," Lucia said, without preamble. "Yes, 6 years." "You have been married?" "No." "Children?" "No." "Why not?" He held her gaze. "Because I lived the wrong kind of life for most of my adult years, and I knew it, and I chose not to bring anyone into it." She considered this. "That was thoughtful, at least." "It was the one thoughtful thing about my life for a long time," he said. A pause. "What do you do now?" "I'm in the process of deciding," he said. "I have resources. I've been thinking about whether there's something here, in the Allegheny region, that could use development of the kind I know how to do." He had been thinking about this with increasing seriousness. The Hollow and its surrounding towns, the infrastructure that could use investment of the careful, community-directed kind. "I'm not ready to present it yet, but I'm building towards something useful." Lucia looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes and let her look. "Elena has been very careful," she said finally. "For a long time. She doesn't give things easily." "I know," he said. "I've watched her for a year. She gives things exactly when they're ready and exactly to the right extent. She doesn't hedge and she doesn't perform. I think that's the most valuable quality I've encountered in another person." Another pause. "You love her," Lucia said, not a question. "Completely," he said, also not a question. Lucia drank her coffee. "She told me you grow plants," she said. He blinked, slightly surprised. "Yes." "7 of them now?" "8. I got a lemon tree." Something happened on Lucia's face that was not quite a smile, but was the structural precursor to one. "That's ambitious for the Alleghenies," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I'm optimistic." She looked at him for a long, final moment, and then she nodded, once, with the small, decisive movement of a woman who had made her assessment and was at peace with it. "Good," she said. Elena, when she came back from the kitchen, looked between them with her clear eyes, reading the room in the instant she entered it. "Well," she said. "He's optimistic about lemon trees," her mother said. "I respect that." Marco looked at Elena. She looked at him. The small warmth in her eyes was not the small warmth he'd been seeing all year. It was something fuller, brighter, the look of a woman who had been seen in context and found the seeing good. He asked her mother, formally and directly, before they left. He asked in the hallway, with Lucia and Sophia both present, which he had decided was the right way, witnessed, unhurried, in front of the people she loved. "I would like to marry your daughter," he said to Lucia. "I'd like your blessing, and I will wait as long as that requires." Lucia looked at him. Then she looked at Elena. Elena's face was... He had seen her composed and working and laughing and frightened and determined, and he had not quite seen this, undone, briefly, in the best possible way, open, the shape of herself, entirely. "You don't need my blessing," Lucia said. "She's 42 years old. But you have it." He turned to Elena. She was already nodding. "Yes," she said. "Marco, yes." He had a ring, a simple thing, a single dark stone set in plain gold, nothing that tried too hard, and he put it on her finger in the hallway of her mother's Philadelphia row house, and Lucia made a sound that was not entirely not crying, and Sophia said something in Spanish that was almost certainly a blessing, and Marco stood in the small, warm hallway with Elena's hands in his, and felt, for the first time in his life, the specific and irreversible sensation of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows he will not be leaving. He was home. He had been looking for it in the wrong places for 46 years, and it had been waiting for him in a small town he'd chosen at random on a map, in a woman with a measuring tape around her neck and dark eyes that didn't flinch, in the slow and patient accumulation of mornings and coffee plants and ordinary things. He was home. Winter came again to Marin's Hollow, the second one, the reliable one. The one that Marco watched arrive from the porch of the Holt house with the feeling of a man who knew what was coming and had chosen to be there for it. The lemon tree was inside, by the kitchen window, where he'd moved it in October when the first frosts began. It had not, despite his optimism, produced lemons yet. It was a project of the long-term kind, the kind that rewarded patience over seasons rather than months. He had explained this to Elena, who had said, "Good, you have patience now." He had thought about this and found it true in a way it had not been true before. He had, over the course of a winter and a spring and a summer and now a second winter, learned a great many things in Marin's Hollow. He had learned the names of hardware and gauges. He had learned to braise and roast and reduce a sauce properly. He had learned the trails above the hollow and the names of the plants that grew on them, and the places where the creek ran fastest and clearest. He had learned that Doris Schraff's opinions, delivered in the form of observations, were almost invariably correct. He had learned that Father Michael played chess, and was willing to be beaten by a man who had once played chess against the Sicilian cardinal and won. He had learned that the things worth having were built slowly and required showing up daily, and did not reward the kinds of shortcuts that power and money could buy. That the coffee plant produced coffee cherries only when it was ready, not when it was pressured. That a friendship with a retired mailman was as solid a thing as anything he had built in 26 years of building things that were supposed to last. He had learned, most importantly, to be afraid of the right things. Not of exposure, not of loss of control, not of the erosion of power. He was afraid now of the good things, the lemon tree, the plants, the house, the woman across the road, in the way that you were afraid for things you couldn't afford to lose. Not paranoid fear, attentive fear, the fear that kept you looking after what mattered. Elena and he had set the wedding for March. Not a large one, the hollow, Father Michael's cracked bell church, the people they had made their daily life with. Patty was making the cake. Franklin would walk the dogs past the church and say it was accidental, and nobody would believe him. Bob Schraft would be there, with his particular silent approval. Doris would be in the front row, and would permit herself precisely 2 tears and no more. Lucia was coming from Philadelphia. She had called Marco twice since November, both times with questions about the house and the hollow, and whether the lemon tree could survive the Pennsylvania winter. He had reported, truthfully, that they were managing together. She had not asked again about his past. He thought she had decided, in the way of practical women, that the past was settled and the present was what deserved attention. He had finalized, in December, the last of the organizational disconnections. Santoro had taken everything, cleanly, with the dignified completeness of a well-executed succession. The man who had come to the shop in November had been, per Santoro's brief and decisive report, persuaded of the absolute inadvisability of any future such ventures. The Marchetti situation had resolved itself through the organizational gravity of competing interests, as these things sometimes did. He was free. Not innocent, he would never be that, and he had stopped wanting the thing that word implied. But free, which was different. The weight was still there. It would always be there. But it was his weight, acknowledged, accounted for, carried in the open rather than hidden. He was not the man he had been. He was the man he had tried to become, imperfectly and daily, for a year and 3 months, in a small town where the bell was cracked and the dogs were golden, and the woman who would marry him made things fit exactly. On the morning of the winter solstice, he walked to the shop at 6:30 and let himself in with his key and started the coffee. Elena came down from the apartment above at 6:55, in her robe and her particular morning disarray, dark hair loose, eyes still waking up. She stopped in the doorway of the workroom and looked at him. "You made coffee," she said. "I make coffee every morning," he said. "I know." She came in and leaned against the work table and accepted the cup he handed her. "I'm still not used to it." "Good," he said. "I don't want you to be used to it. I want it to keep meaning something." She looked at him over her cup. The shop was warm, and the workroom smelled of fabric and her, and on the dressmaker's form in the corner stood the Morrison girl's dress. She was making a second dress now, she told people, practice for March. And Volta was in the armchair, conducting his surveillance, and the first pale light of December was beginning to come through the windows. "What are you doing today?" she said. "Hardware store," he said. "Then the Kowalskis need help with something in the feed store." Then I was thinking about starting the bread I found in your grandmother's book. She blinked. You found my grandmother's recipe book? You left it here. It was on the table. He paused. I hope that's all right. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had learned to recognize as the Elena version of undone. Not showy, not demonstrative, just open. She would have liked you, she said. She would have liked a man who paid attention. I pay a great deal of attention, he said. I know, she said. It's one of the things about you. They stood in the morning workroom with their coffee and the pale winter light coming in and the work of the day not yet begun, and he looked at her. Elena Vasquez, seamstress of Marin's Hollow, woman who made things fit, who had opened a door in October for a man who arrived with one bag and a complicated past, and who had, against all reasonable expectation, let him stay. He thought about the man he had been and the man he was trying to be, and the distance between those two men that he had crossed, daily, imperfectly, with the particular discipline of someone who understood that the crossing never really ended. He thought about Cesare, as he still did, not every day now, but often enough. He thought about all the distances he had created, and all the distance he had traveled to arrive here, in this room, on this morning. He thought about the coffee plant on his kitchen windowsill, which had, in October, produced its first small cluster of cherries, red, waxy, extraordinary, and which he had photographed and sent to the hardware store teenager, who had responded with unprecedented enthusiasm and several exclamation points. He thought, this is what I was for. I just needed to find it. Elena was watching him think, which she did, which he had come to treasure, being watched by someone who wasn't looking for a threat or an angle, but simply watching because they found him worth attending to. Where did you go? She said. Nowhere, he said. I was right here. She put down her coffee and came to him, and he put his arms around her, and she put her head against his chest, and he could feel her breathing against him in the quiet morning. Outside, Marin's Hollow was waking up. Franklin's dogs would be on the creek path soon. Patty would be starting the first coffee in the diner. The cracked bell would ring on Sunday, as it always rang, defiant and imperfect, and entirely, stubbornly, itself. Marco held the woman who was going to marry him in March, in a small town he had arrived in with nothing and made into everything. And he thought that a man was given, if he was lucky and if he was willing, a chance to become something better than what he had made of himself. He thought that he had used his chance. He was 47 years old, and he had never been so young. He held on. Outside, the first snow of the second winter was beginning to fall, soft and unhurried, covering the hollow in its clean white patience. The bell would ring on Sunday. The lemon tree was waiting in the kitchen. The light was on. The Morrison girl cried before she put the dress on. She cried when she saw it on the form, and then she cried again when she put it on. And Elena had anticipated both sets of tears and had a handkerchief ready each time. The dress was exactly what Elena had wanted it to be, not what photographed well, though it would photograph beautifully, but what felt right. The girl stood in front of the mirror in Elena's workroom and looked at herself and understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to wear something made specifically for the shape you were. It's perfect, the girl said. It fits, Elena said. That's all. She walked the dress to the church herself on the March morning of the Morrison wedding, and she hung it in the vestibule with tissue paper and care, and then she walked across the hollow to the Holt house, where Marco was making breakfast, and the lemon tree was in the kitchen window, and the coffee plant had new cherries forming, and the spring was beginning, carefully, in the garden that had been left to itself for too long and was now being tended. She came in through the back door. He was at the stove. Ready? He said. For what? She said. The Morrison wedding's at 2. Our own, in 3 weeks. He turned and looked at her. For whatever comes next. She hung up her coat. She went to his kitchen table and sat down in the morning light. Volta, who had migrated to the Holt house by increments and now treated it as a second domain, was in the window beside the lemon tree, conducting his eternal surveillance of the garden. Yes, she said, I'm ready. He brought her coffee. He sat across from her. The morning light found them both, in the kitchen of the house on Birch and Callaway, in the town of Marin's Hollow, Pennsylvania, in March. Outside, the first crocuses were coming through the snow.